Hello, and welcome to the presentation on worldviews and background beliefs. We will also be giving some reminders about the differences between inductive and deductive arguments. It is important to note that these lectures are not meant to cover everything in the text. They are meant to cover the most important or difficult details. If you do not read the text, you will not have all the information required for the quizzes and tests. In this way, this online class is no different from a real-time course. Lectures are meant to supplement the readings, not replace them. Also, as always, you should have read the material before viewing this presentation. If you haven't, please stop the presentation and view it after reading the material. This is for your own benefit, as studies show that students learn best this way. If you don't do this, you will be receiving less benefit for the same amount of effort. With that advice given, let's move on. First, the definition of cogent reasoning. The terms valid and sound were used to describe deductive arguments. Cogent reasoning is a way of describing inductive arguments. The key difference between inductive and deductive arguments, you remember, is that deductive arguments claim that the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. The conclusion, in other words, does not tell you anything you could not have learned strictly from the premises themselves. Inductive arguments, however, go further than the evidence presented in the premises. Inductive arguments effectively claim that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is likely, but not necessarily true. Often inductive arguments are based on the use of senses, repeated observations, and pattern recognition. Neither deductive nor inductive logic is better than the other. Both are necessary to get along. Deductive reasoning allows us to gain certainty from categories, and inductive reasoning lets us learn from past experiences. So, as we have said, cogent reasoning relates to inductive arguments specifically. Here are the requirements of cogent reasoning. First is strength. Remember that inductive arguments are not valid or invalid, but strong or weak. The book refers to this as validity 2 at some points, but the real logical terms are strong and weak. The second condition is the believability of the premises. How likely are they to be true? And the third condition is the discovery and use of all relevant information. Since inductive arguments go beyond the premises, leaving out important information can easily lead you to the wrong conclusion. So, the two key elements being added to the basic requirement of strength is the believability of the premises and the discovery and use of all relevant information. When attempting to determine whether an argument is cogent, one should evaluate these three items. How strongly does the conclusion follow from the premises? Is it almost always true, but not certainly true because it's an inductive argument, remember? Or is it very likely true, or just likely true? Or is it a weak argument where the premises could be true and the conclusion very likely still doesn't follow? Next, you evaluate how likely the premises are to be true themselves. Since the first step was to determine how strongly the conclusion follows from the premises, the next thing to reasonably do is determine how likely those premises themselves are to be true. The final step is to ask yourself if the argument is leaving out any important information, or if there is likely a significant amount of relevant information that is yet to be discovered. You should notice an analogy here. Soundness is to deductive validity, as argument cogency is to inductive strength. Sound arguments are deductively valid arguments with true premises, while cogent arguments are inductively strong arguments with justified premises using all relevant information. So, as a reminder, sound arguments are deductively valid arguments with true premises. Remember that the conclusion of a sound argument must be true. This follows from the fact that sound arguments are valid, and in a valid argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. Cogent arguments are inductively strong arguments with justified premises using all of the relevant information. The conclusion of a cogent argument is likely to be true. The more cogent the argument, the more likely the conclusion is to be true. This is important to note. Not all levels of cogency are the same. An argument could be not cogent, cogent, very cogent, and so forth. With deductive arguments, there are no degrees like this. They are either valid or not. They are either sound or not. Now on to background beliefs. There are two types of background beliefs that the book discusses: judgments regarding matters of fact and judgments about value. There may be others as well, but we will focus on these. Matters of fact are questions about the external world that can usually be settled either with empirical evidence or with abstract mathematical deduction. They rely in some way on a clear correlation to the state of the world or a relationship of categories. Here are some examples of matters of fact. Washington was the first U.S. president. Human genetic information is carried by DNA. The moon reflects sunlight. Mars is about 5 light minutes away from the Earth, and we only use 10% of our brains. Notice this last item especially. The idea that we only use 10% of our brains is false. It is some scientific misinformation, it's completely bogus, but is nevertheless commonly repeated in television and movies. Indeed, a movie called Lucy recently used this as part of its premise. Nevertheless, it is false, as any neurologist would tell you. So why list it here? Because even though it is false, it is a type of question that is a matter-of-fact question. Matter-of-fact questions are either true or false. To say something is a matter-of-fact question, in other words, does not mean that it has a true answer, but that the answer is either true or false once its correlation to the outside world is fully understood. It is either true or false that human beings only use 10% of our brains. It is false. Matters of value include ethical judgments, judgments about beauty, judgments about importance, and so forth. What makes these different is that they are seen to be largely subjective, or at least their truth or falsity is difficult to determine with an empirical test or to deduce with a mathematical or other abstract derivation. It is important to note, however, that this does not mean that matters of value cannot be grounded, or even that they cannot be true or false. What makes the category worth distinguishing is in some ways difficult to put into words. Questions regarding matters of value are usually very difficult to prove empirically, that is to say with scientific or observational evidence. They also tend to rely on larger background theory that would be or require a significant amount of argument. But it is important to note that most ethical theories claim that their positions are not just subjectively true, but actually true as a matter of fact. So, saying that murder is wrong is a matter of value question, but depending on what ethical theory you subscribe to, it can also be true or false. The key difference between these and normal matters of fact is that it would be difficult to prove that murder is wrong by going out and making measurements. It would require an underlying theory about what we should morally value and why. Such a theory could be true or false, however. For the most part, even though it is difficult to define, it is not so difficult to tell if a question should be considered a value or factual question. If the question relates to ethics or life priorities, it is likely a question of value. What painting is the most beautiful? Is abortion morally acceptable? These things are considered value questions, even if under some theories they may have a definite solution. If the question can be settled with more scientific investigation or through the analysis of concepts alone, then the question is likely a factual one. Here are some examples of matters of value. The lives of my family are more important to me than the lives of strangers. Sophie Gimbry Anderson's Take the Fair Face of a Woman is more beautiful than Van Gogh's Starry Night. It is better to be smart than to be strong. It is better to express yourself and stand out than conform and blend in. New experiences are good, all other things being equal. Again, these are examples of matters of value. Here's a collage of images I put together to try to illustrate a number of worldviews and background beliefs. The idea here is to imagine how background beliefs might affect the way you view the world. So compare a child that is raised in a very tech-savvy background throughout their lives versus a child raised in an Amish environment. Or compare somebody being raised and ferried everywhere in a limousine and living in a mansion to somebody living in a house like this one. Or compare and contrast being raised in a fundamentalist Christian household versus being raised as a Muslim, or being raised in a military family, or being raised in a family that goes to Occupy Wall Street and sing-alongs. One's experiences and one's background's beliefs might vary or be very different. For example, if one were raised as an immigrant working in the fields for a living, compared to if you were one of the very few people raised as royalty and brought up to think that their bloodlines were special. So, all of these things and more might affect one's background beliefs, and one's background beliefs are likely to affect what arguments one takes seriously, whose expertise one listens to, and the values one has, and one's priorities in life. Worldviews form part of our background beliefs. They can change. They're influenced by culture, family, friends, even genetics. The effect of these worldviews on how we evaluate arguments is hard to notice because we are immersed in them. There's an old saying that the last thing a fish would notice is water. Like the air around us, our worldviews are ever present, and we are seldom aware of them. This means that when evaluating arguments, we have to try to step out of our habitual beliefs and evaluate the evidence. If our goal is to arrive at the truth, we have to put aside our inclination to see the views we already have as common sense and see if we can arrive at the same conclusions if we attempt to evaluate the evidence more objectively. One of the things we need to be wary of are insufficiently grounded beliefs, beliefs that are not sufficiently justified. Here are some things that make determining how well-grounded beliefs are more difficult. We tend to want to hold on to our beliefs. When we have stated our beliefs to people, we tend to hold on to them even more strongly. In addition, we are vulnerable to a whole host of psychological weaknesses that allow us to maintain the beliefs we like, keep beliefs that we already hold, and dismiss those beliefs that we don't like or that make us uncomfortable. A few of these weaknesses are confirmation bias, selective memory, and projection bias. There are many others. We may mention some of these later in the course. The point is that, without actively trying to combat our own psychological inclinations, we, meaning all human beings, tend to systematically fool ourselves. In order to improve our inductive reasoning, one thing we need to actively do is be aware of these weaknesses and work to overcome them. These psychological weaknesses are so deeply ingrained that nobody can perfectly overcome them. But by trying to be objective, we can go a long way towards doing so. The book lists two kinds of background beliefs: beliefs about human nature and beliefs about the reliability of information sources. I'm sure you could think of other kinds of background beliefs as well, but these are two major areas or categories of such beliefs. Under the category of the nature of human nature are such issues as: what motivates people? Are people basically altruistic, self-interested, or a little of both? Can people change their habits? How do people learn? What makes people happy? One thing to be constantly evaluating in order to be a cogent reasoner is the reliability of information sources. There are lots of sources we use for information: television, newspapers, magazines, Wikipedia, blogs, YouTube, textbook, and experts. We shouldn't assume that sources are reliable without justification. Further, it is important to note that even when sources are reliable, some of the story is often missing. When dealing with scientific issues, for example, it is not unusual for the news media to misinterpret complex issues in fundamental ways. There's an old saying in computer science: garbage in, garbage out. It means that no matter how good a program is at processing data, if you put bad data into it, you're going to get an inaccurate result. Human beings need to worry about the same thing. If we take in bad information and assume the premises are true, we will reach inaccurate conclusions. No method of evaluating the reliability of information is perfect, but the scientific method is one of the best available. Here are some reasons the authors think that science is especially reliable. It has a method designed to improve objectivity. It is peer-reviewed. Findings are repeatedly tested. There are mathematical standards for showing statistically relevant results, as opposed to people simply feeling or intuiting that some feature is common enough to be statistically important. It generates broad theories that produce practical results. It is self-correcting. Of course, one of the problems is that most people don't have the expertise to fully understand much of what scientists are doing. It is very easy for people to misunderstand or misuse scientific information. Many times people will find an odd man out experiment, a paper about an experiment that had an unusual result and that goes against the consensus of scientific opinion, and then cite it as if it was the majority or best supported view. One thing that is important to note is that when hundreds of experiments are done, statistically there are going to be some that have unusual results. Test enough people for the effects of smoking, and some will show that smokers live longer than average instead of shorter lifespans. But this does not mean that smoking isn't harmful. It is an artifact of statistics. Understanding some aspects of science requires moderate investment of time, and others require a dedication of years or even a lifetime of study. And that ends this presentation. Again, these presentations are not meant to cover everything in the chapter. You should have done the reading as well. That said, until next